The sound of the pen clicking was the loudest thing in the room. My son Mark pushed the glossy brochure across the mahogany dining table. "It's the highest-rated facility in the county, Dad," he said. His voice was soft, the way you talk to a child or a wounded animal. I looked at the photos of smiling seniors playing bingo in a room that smelled like industrial bleach through the paper. Then I looked at the one-way flight confirmation to Da Nang tucked inside my phone case. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked toward the front door. I knew if I stayed one more minute, I'd be spending the rest of my life in a carpeted cubicle waiting for Tuesday's Jell-O. 48 hours later, I was standing on a street corner in Da Nang. Thousands of motorbikes buzzed past me like a swarm of angry bees. The heat was a physical weight, thick with the smell of grilled pork exhaust fumes and salt from the nearby sea. A woman in a conical hat nudged me aside, shouting something in a language that sounded like music and a drill at the same time. My suitcase felt like it was filled with lead, and my knees were already throbbing. I pulled out my phone and saw 6 missed calls from Mark. One text read, "Dad, stop being dramatic. You can't even find your glasses without help. Come home." I hit delete. People think I'm having a late-life crisis. Maybe I am. But back in Ohio, my kids were already talking about me in the past tense while I was still sitting in the room. They were measuring my house for new curtains and deciding which of my books to keep. Now I'm halfway across the world with nothing but a backpack and a bank account that suddenly feels like a fortune. In the US, I was a problem to be solved. Here, I'm just a man in a linen shirt trying to cross the street without dying. As the sun began to set over the marble mountains, turning the sky a bruised purple, I realized I'd made a massive mistake. I had no hotel reservation, I didn't know a single word of Vietnamese, and the man in the leather jacket had been following me for the last 3 blocks. I thought leaving was the hard part. I was wrong. It was only the beginning. The man wasn't just walking, he was matching my pace. Every time I slowed down to glance at a faded street sign, he stopped to look at his phone. In Ohio, the biggest threat I faced was a slippery bathtub or a high-sodium dinner. Here, I felt like a walking ATM with a target painted on my back. My pulse was thumping in my ears, a frantic rhythm I hadn't felt in decades. If I lost my bag now, I lost my passport, my cash, and my only shot at a life that wasn't dictated by my son. My legs were shaking, and it wasn't just the arthritis. The humidity was a slick film on my palms, making it nearly impossible to grip the handle of my suitcase. I ducked into a narrow, dimly lit alleyway, hoping to catch him off guard, but the silence there was even more terrifying than the noise of the street. The neon glow of the main road began to fade behind me. I realized I wasn't just lost in a city, I was lost in a choice I wasn't sure I was strong enough to make. I could almost hear Mark's voice echoing in my head. "I told you, Dad, you're not capable of being on your own." If I called him now, he'd have me on a flight back to the sterile smell of industrial bleach within 24 hours. He'd win, and I'd spend my remaining years staring at the same 4 beige walls. Dying in a foreign alley felt like a nightmare, but living the next 20 years in a care facility felt like a sentence. I had to keep moving, but my breath was getting shorter. The footsteps behind me picked up speed. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound of rubber soles on uneven pavement. I reached the end of the alley and hit a dead end, a corrugated metal gate locked with a heavy rusted chain. I turned around my back, pressed against the cold metal, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The man in the leather jacket stepped into the dim light of the single flickering bulb above us. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out something dark. I braced myself for the end. "Excuse me, sir," he said his English, thick but clear. I blinked, my hands trembling as he stepped closer. He held out my leather wallet, the one with my credit cards and the faded photo of my late wife. I hadn't even realized it had slipped out of my pocket during my frantic walk. "You dropped this back there," he said, pointing toward the main road. I stood there paralyzed. My mind had already planned my funeral, yet here was a stranger returning my life to me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his. He didn't try to grab me. He didn't demand a reward. He just nodded, smiled a bit, and disappeared back into the shadows of the alley. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty air. My voice was a thin, cracked thing. I leaned against the rusted gate, waiting for my heart to stop trying to escape my chest. In Ohio, Mark always told me the world was too fast for me now. He said I'd get scammed or hurt the moment I stepped off the porch. He looked at me and saw a liability, someone who needed a controlled environment, a meal schedule, and a wristband with a barcode. Walking out of that alley, I felt a strange surge of electricity. I wasn't a liability here. I was just a man who had been lucky. I managed to find my way back to the main street. The neon lights of Da Nang felt different now, less like a warning and more like an invitation. I found a small street-side stall with tiny plastic stools, the kind that looked like they belonged in a kindergarten. I sat down, my knees clicking, and ordered a sa fei moi because I saw the person next to me drinking it. The salt in the coffee was a shock, but a good one. It woke up my senses in a way the bland food at the assisted living center never could. Everything people tell you about retiring abroad is usually about the money. They talk about the $3 meals and the $500 apartments. They paint a picture of a permanent vacation where your Social Security check turns you into a king. For the first hour sitting on that tiny stool, I believed it too. I looked at the vibrant crowd and felt like I'd found a loophole to aging. I thought I had successfully disappeared. I thought I had finally outrun my son's expectations and the sterile future he had planned for me. Then a woman at the next table shifted her chair. She had been watching me since I sat down. She wasn't looking at me with the curiosity of a local or the kindness of the man in the alley. She was holding a printed photo in her hand, glancing from the paper to my face. She stood up and walked toward me, and that's when I realized my escape had a paper trail I hadn't accounted for. "Are you David?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were like two cold stones. I didn't answer. I looked at the photo in her hand. It was me, caught by my neighbor's security camera 3 weeks ago, dragging my scuffed suitcase down the driveway at 4 a.m. A ghost caught on film. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said, sitting down on the tiny plastic stool across from me without being invited. "I'm a private investigator, your son Mark. He's been very busy." I felt a cold bead of sweat slide down my spine despite the thick Da Nang heat. "How did you find me?" "You used your credit card at the airport in Seoul," she replied, "and you checked into a hotel under your real name. You're not very good at being a ghost David." She didn't look like a villain. She looked like she was doing a job. But what she said next made the salt in my coffee taste like ash. Mark didn't just hire me to find you." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's told the U.S. consulate that you have early onset dementia, that you're a danger to yourself. He's already started the legal process to freeze your accounts." I felt the air leave my lungs. Dementia, I'd forgotten my keys once or twice. I'd missed a doctor's appointment because I was tired of being poked and prodded, but I wasn't losing my mind. I was just losing my patience with his control. "He can't do that," I whispered. My hands were shaking. "He's already doing it," she said. She pulled out a second paper. It was a copy of a legal filing from an Ohio court. "The nursing home wasn't the goal, David. The house was. He signed a sales contract with a developer 2 days after you boarded that flight." The world around me blurred. The motorbikes, the neon signs, the smell of grilled pork. It all felt like a dream turning into a nightmare. My son hadn't been worried about my safety. He had been waiting for an excuse to liquidate my life and turn my childhood home into a commission check. I looked at the woman. "Why are you telling me this? Why not just call him and tell him where I am?" She looked at the busy street, then back at me. A flicker of something, maybe guilt, crossed her face. "Because my father is in a home back in Oregon. He hates every second of it. And because Mark hasn't paid the second half of my retainer yet." She tapped the table. "You have about 48 hours before your cards stop working. If I were you, I'd stop being a tourist and start being a local. Fast." She stood up and disappeared into the crowd before I could ask her anything else. I sat there staring at my salt coffee. I had come to Vietnam to find freedom, but I had accidentally walked into a trap. I wasn't just a man on vacation. I was a man with a countdown clock over his head. I needed cash. Lots of it. And I needed it before Mark pressed the button that would turn me into a penniless stranger in a foreign land. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't go back to my hotel. If she could find me, anyone could. I started walking toward the older part of the city, where the alleys got narrower and the lights got dimmer. I found a small guest house that didn't have a website, a place where the sign was just a hand-painted board in Vietnamese. The woman at the desk looked at my expensive watch and my clean shirt. She didn't ask for a passport. She just held up 5 fingers. $500,000, she said. About $20. I handed her the bills, feeling the weight of the remaining cash in my wallet. It wasn't much. Maybe enough for a week if I ate like a bird. I climbed the stairs to a room that smelled like mothballs and jasmine. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was as hard as a brick. That's when I realized the biggest mistake I'd made. I'd been so focused on leaving Ohio that I hadn't realized what I'd left behind. In my rush, I'd left my laptop, the one with the saved passwords and the two-factor authentication for my retirement fund. The only thing I had was my phone, and the battery was at 12%. I reached into my pocket for my charger. It wasn't there. I must have left it at the cafe when the woman surprised me. I looked at the phone. A notification popped up. A message from Mark. "Dad, I know where you are. Stop this nonsense before you get hurt. I've called the authorities. It's for your own good." Then the screen flickered and died. I was alone in a city of 1 million people with no way to access my money, no way to contact the outside world, and a son who was legally trying to erase my existence. I realized then that moving to Vietnam wasn't the end of my struggle. It was just the beginning of a war. And then there was a knock on my door. Not a polite knock. A heavy rhythmic thud that made the wooden frame rattle. "Open up," a man's voice said in English. It was deep authoritative. "We know you're in there, David." It wasn't Mark, and it didn't sound like the police. I looked at the window. It was a 3-story drop to a concrete alley filled with trash bins. I had 2 choices: stay and let them take me back to a locked ward in Ohio, or jump into the dark. I grabbed my bag and headed for the ledge. I thought I knew what fear was. I was wrong. I climbed onto the sill, the humid air hitting my face like a wet towel. Below, a stray cat hissed in the shadows. "David, don't make this harder," the voice called out. I heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. I didn't wait to see who was on the other side. I let go. The fall wasn't like the movies. There was no slow motion, just a sudden sickening drop and then a bone-jarring thud. I didn't hit the concrete. I slammed into a mountain of overflowing trash bags. The stench of rotting dragon fruit and seafood hit me like a physical punch, but I was alive. My left ankle screamed, but I didn't have time to check for brakes. Above me, a flashlight beam cut through the dark, dancing over the trash. "He jumped!" someone yelled. I scrambled to my feet, leaning against the damp brick wall. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I turned and limped into the darkness of the alley, my shoes squelching in things I didn't want to identify. I thought the private investigator was my guardian angel. I thought her warning was a gift. I was wrong. I ducked behind a stack of blue water jugs as a motorbike buzzed past. I pulled out my wallet, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. I looked at the ID card the woman had touched. There on the back was a tiny transparent film, a GPS tracker. She hadn't been helping me escape Mark. She was herd-dogging me. She wanted me to panic. She wanted me to run to a safe place so she could lead them straight to me. She knew I'd go to a place like this, a place where I was invisible, or so I thought. But there was something else. Something I realized as I peeled that tracker off and stuck it to the bottom of a passing garbage truck. Mark didn't want the house. Not really. The house in Ohio was old. It needed a new roof, and the basement flooded every spring. It was worth $300,000 tops, not enough to hire an international private investigator and a team of retrieval specialists. The real reason they were hunting me was in the photo of my late wife, the one tucked behind my driver's license. Before Sarah died, she had been obsessed with the early days of Bitcoin. She'd bought a handful of them when they were worth pennies, mostly as a joke. I'd forgotten all about it until I saw the login credentials written in her messy handwriting on the back of that faded picture. Mark must have found her old notes. He didn't want a nursing home for me. He wanted the private key to a fortune that had grown into millions while I was busy mourning. I wasn't just a liability to my son. I was a walking vault. I watched the garbage truck turn the corner, taking the tracker with it. I was finally off the radar, but I was also penniless and alone in a city where I didn't speak the language. I needed a plan, and I needed it before the sun came up. I started walking toward the Han River. The lights of the Dragon Bridge were still glowing, a massive neon beast guarding the water. I found a public bench and sat down, trying to look like just another sleepless expat. Then a shadow fell over me. I looked up expecting the man from the hotel. Instead, it was the man from the alley, the one who had returned my wallet hours ago. He wasn't smiling anymore. He held a cell phone out toward me. On the screen was a translation app. "They are not the police," the screen read. "And they are not looking for your son's money." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Then who are they?" I whispered. The man looked around, his eyes sharp and wary. He typed a few more words and showed me the screen. They're the people who sold your wife the coins, and they've been waiting 10 years for you to come to Vietnam. I thought I was the one with the secret. It turned out I was the only one who didn't know the truth. I stared at the man's phone until the words blurred. Sarah hadn't bought those coins on some flashy American exchange. She'd bought them in a back alley cafe in Da Nang a decade ago, while I was busy taking photos of temples. My quiet wife had been living a double life right under my nose. "How do you know this?" I asked, my voice cracking. Min didn't type. He simply pointed to a faded scar on his forearm in the shape of a small, jagged S. I felt the air turn to ice in my lungs. Sarah had a matching one on her shoulder. She told me it was from a childhood accident. Most people in my situation would have run straight to the U.S. consulate. That's the sensible thing to do. You find a man in a suit, show him your passport, and ask for protection. But I realized that was a fatal mistake. Mark had already laid the groundwork. To the consulate, I was just a runaway senior with a medical file claiming I was losing my mind. Going there wasn't seeking help. It was turning myself in. The safe path was a dead end. I had to take the insane one. Min grabbed my sleeve and pulled me toward a waiting motorbike. I didn't hesitate. I climbed on behind him, my bad ankle throbbing. We tore through the narrow streets, the engine's roar echoing off the damp walls. He didn't take me to a hotel or a tourist area. He took me to a hem, a labyrinth of alleys so narrow you could touch the houses on both sides. This wasn't the Vietnam from the brochures. This was a city of shadows where the smell of incense mixed with exhaust and frying fish. Min stopped in front of a heavy iron door. He knocked a specific rhythm. A small slit opened, a pair of dark eyes scanned us, and the door groaned open. Inside the room was filled with old computer monitors and the hum of industrial fans. A young girl, maybe 20, was staring at a screen filled with scrolling green text. She didn't look up when we entered. "Hi, this is Lynn." Min said his English suddenly much better than the translation app suggested. "She's been tracking the wallets, not just yours, the ones your wife's friends are trying to unlock." I stood in the center of the room feeling like an intruder in my own life. I thought about the nursing home Mark had picked out. It was called Golden Oaks. It had beige walls, scheduled naps, and a garden where nothing ever grew. It was designed to keep people safe until they faded away. In that sterile world, I was a case number. Here in this humid, chaotic room, I was a target. And strangely, for the first time in years, I felt alive. Lynn finally looked up. She tapped a key and a map of Da Nang appeared on the screen. 3 red dots were moving in our direction. "The tracker you put on the garbage truck," she said, her voice flat. "They found it. They realized you played them. Now they're not just looking for the money. They're looking for the man who tried to be clever." I looked at the red dots. They were less than 5 minutes away. "I can hide you," Min said, looking at me intensely. "But the moment I do, you cease to exist in the eyes of the law. No passport, no bank accounts, no son. You'll be a ghost in the machine just like your wife was." I thought about the rocking chair waiting for me in Ohio. I thought about the barcode on the wristband. "Do it," I said. Min nodded and handed me a pair of scissors and a bottle of dark hair dye. "Start with the hair, then we change the face." As I stood over a cracked porcelain sink scrubbing the black liquid into my scalp, I realized I wasn't just escaping a nursing home. I was erasing the man I had been for 65 years. I finished and looked in the mirror. The man staring back looked like a stranger, haggard, dark-haired, and desperate. Just then, a loud crash echoed from the front of the building. The iron door rattled on its hinges. "They're here," Lynn whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "And they brought someone you know." I leaned over her shoulder to see the security feed. A black SUV had pulled up. A man stepped out adjusting his tie. It wasn't a retrieval specialist. It was Mark. And he wasn't looking like a worried son. He was holding a handheld scanner, his face twisted in a look of pure, cold greed. I realized then that Mark didn't need the authorities to find me. He had something much more effective. He had my wife's second phone, the one I didn't even know existed. The iron door groaned under the weight of a heavy kick. Mark's voice came through the metal, muffled but sharp. "Dad, stop this. I have the authorities with me. You're not well." He sounded so sincere. To anyone else, he sounded like a grieving son. But I saw his face on that screen. I saw the hunger in his eyes. "He's pinging the second phone," Lynn whispered. Her fingers danced across the keys. "The signal is bouncing off the local towers. He's within 10 feet. Min didn't panic. He walked to the back of the room and shoved a heavy wooden wardrobe aside. Behind it wasn't a wall, but a narrow, jagged hole leading into the next building. "This is what Mark doesn't understand," Min said, gesturing for me to follow. "In America, everything is a paper trail. Your life is a series of digital locks. If they have the key, they own you." I squeezed through the gap, the scent of old wood and frying garlic filling my nose. We were in a kitchen now. An elderly woman was stirring a pot of soup, her face mapped with deep wrinkles. She didn't look surprised to see a man with wet black hair, dye dripping down his neck. She just pointed toward the back door. In Vietnam, Min continued, "The real power isn't in the bank. It's in the hem, these alleys. The government has maps, but the people have the shortcuts." That's when I realized the unfair advantage of being here. In Ohio, if the police want you, they find you in minutes. Everything is connected. But here, if the neighborhood decides you don't exist, you are invisible. We stepped out into a different alley identical to the last one. Motorbikes were parked in tight rows. Children were playing with a plastic ball. "Mark has the phone," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "He'll find us." "Let him," Lynn said, emerging from the hole behind us. She was holding a small silver device. "I just mirrored the signal. Right now, his scanner says you're currently moving toward the Han River on the back of a garbage truck." I almost laughed. The genius son, the corporate shark, was chasing a pile of rotting fruit while I stood 5 feet away from his search perimeter. But the relief didn't last. My ankle gave way and I slumped against a damp brick wall. "I can't keep running, Min. I have no money. My cards are flagged. I'm an old man with a bad leg and a bag of dirty clothes." Min knelt down. He didn't offer me a lecture. He didn't tell me to stay positive. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered copper coin. It had a hole in the center. "Sarah didn't just buy Bitcoin, David," he said quietly. "She bought something much more valuable. She bought Tin Nia, the debt of gratitude." He pointed to the old woman in the kitchen. "Her son was in debt to some very bad people 10 years ago. Your wife paid it off. She didn't want interest. She just wanted a place to stay if things ever went wrong." I looked at the coin. I looked at the dark, narrow alleyway that felt more like a fortress than a slum. In the U.S., retirement is a business. It's about how much you can pay to be ignored until you die. Here it was about who remembered you. "The money is safe," Min said. "But to get it, you have to do something Mark would never expect." He looked at the end of the alley. A shadow was moving toward us, a man in a uniform, not a police officer, a private security guard with a Golden Oaks patch on his shoulder. Mark had brought his own jailers from the States. "What do I have to do?" I asked. Min handed me a heavy rusted key. "You have to go back to the hotel, the one you just fled." I stared at him. "That's suicide. He's probably sitting in the lobby." "Exactly," Min smiled. "He's looking for a man who is running away. He's not looking for the man who is coming to collect." I looked at the key. It wasn't for a room. It was for a safe deposit box, one that Sarah had registered under a Vietnamese name decades ago. I stood up my legs screaming, but my mind finally clear. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a ghost with a plan. We moved through the shadows, avoiding the main streets. We reached the back entrance of the hotel just as a black SUV pulled up to the front. I saw Mark get out. He looked frustrated. He was shouting into his phone, his face red. "He's losing his mind," I whispered. "No," Lynn said, checking her tablet. "He's not losing his mind. He's losing his window. The court order in Ohio expires in 24 hours. If he doesn't have you in custody by then, the dementia claim falls apart." I gripped the key. This was the final sprint. I slipped through the service door, past the laundry bins and the smell of industrial bleach. I knew where the boxes were. Basement level, past the manager's office. I reached the vault door. My hands were slick with sweat. I inserted the key and turned. It clicked. I pulled the drawer open. I expected piles of cash or a hardware wallet. Instead, I found a single envelope and a small handheld recording device. I pressed play. "On David." Sarah's voice filled the small room. She sounded younger, full of life. "If you're hearing this, it means Mark has finally shown his true colors. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you the truth about the money, but it wasn't just for us." I heard a thud in the hallway, heavy footsteps. "I know you're in here. Dad!" Mark's voice echoed through the vault. "The tracker pinged. You're trapped." I looked at the envelope. I looked at the recorder. Sarah's voice continued a low whisper. "Don't look for the money in the bank, David. Look at the wall." I turned around. The back of the safe deposit box wasn't metal. It was a false panel. I ripped it away. What I saw inside made my heart stop. It wasn't Bitcoin. It wasn't gold. It was a stack of legal documents, all signed and notarized in Vietnam, dated 5 years ago. The door to the vault swung open. Mark stood there, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild. He saw me holding the papers. "Give them to me," he hissed. "You have no idea what you're holding." "Actually, Mark," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in years, "I know exactly what this is." I held up the top sheet. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a deed. And my son's name wasn't anywhere on it. I looked him in the eye and realized I wasn't just a man who moved to Vietnam. I was the man who owned the very ground he was standing on. "You're trespassing, Mark," I said. And then I saw the two men standing behind him, and they weren't wearing Golden Oaks uniforms. The two men stepped into the light. They weren't wearing the beige uniforms of the Golden Oaks security team. They were wearing dark, tailored suits that cost more than my first house. They didn't look like guards. They looked like owners. "He's with me," Mark said, his voice cracking. He was trying to sound in charge, but his eyes were darting toward the door. "I hired them. Dad, just give me the papers and we can leave this dump." The man on the left, a tall Vietnamese man with a silver watch, didn't even look at Mark. He looked straight at me. "We are not with your son, David. We are the partners Sarah didn't tell you about." I clutched the deed to my chest. Partner Sarah ran a library. She didn't have partners. Sarah ran a network. The man replied. He stepped closer, ignoring Mark completely. The Bitcoin wasn't just a joke investment. It was a pool, a community fund for people who wanted to disappear, and you've just inherited the debt. I looked at the papers. The deed wasn't for a hotel. It was for a holding company, a company that owed millions to the very men standing in front of me. Sarah hadn't left me a kingdom. She'd left me a target on my back. Mark lunged for the recording device in my other hand. "It's in the recorder, the private key. If we give it to them, they'll let us go." I pulled the recorder back, my bad ankle buckling. "You don't care about me, Mark. You never did. You just wanted the key." "Of course I wanted the key," he screamed. All the worried son act vanished. "Do you have any idea how much debt I'm in? The house in Ohio is already gone. Dad, if I don't get those coins, I'm dead." The two men shared a look. It wasn't pity. It was boredom. The tall one pulled out a heavy radio. "The police are upstairs. Your son called them to report a kidnapping. They think you're the victim, David. But if they find those documents, they'll see a money laundering operation that spans 2 continents. My heart stopped. If I walked out now, I'd be arrested. If I stayed here, these men would take the key and bury me in the foundation. "There's a third way," the man said, his voice as smooth as silk. "But it requires a sacrifice, one that your son isn't going to like." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single blank passport. Sarah prepared for this. She knew Mark would come. She knew he couldn't be trusted. She left instructions for what to do with him. I looked at Mark. He was sweating, his face pale in the harsh, fluorescent light of the vault. "Dad, don't listen to them," he pleaded. "They're criminals. Just give me the key. I'm your blood." I looked at the recording device. I pressed the play button one last time. "David," Sarah's voice whispered through the speaker, "the key isn't in the numbers. It's in the name of the man standing behind Mark." I looked past my son. The second man, the one who hadn't spoken, stepped forward. He reached up and pulled back his sleeve. On his forearm was the same jagged S scar that Min had. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Mark with a hunger that made the Golden Oaks guards look like Boy Scouts. "He's the one who sold her out," the man whispered. 10 years ago in this very city, your son was the one who told the creditors where she was. The world tilted. My own son had betrayed his mother before she even died. I felt a cold, hard rage settle in my bones. I looked at the heavy vault door. I looked at the two men. "What's the sacrifice?" I asked. The tall man smiled. "The police are entering the lobby. In 60 seconds, someone is going to jail for the laundry operation. It can be you, or it can be the man who betrayed Sarah." I looked at Mark. He knew it was over. He turned to run, but the heavy steel door of the vault began to slide shut, triggered by a button in the tall man's hand. "Dad, no!" Mark screamed, throwing himself at the closing gap. I stood there holding the deed to a life I didn't recognize, watching the only family I had left get swallowed by the shadows. But as the door clicked shut, I realized something. The tall man hadn't left. He was still in the vault with me, and he was holding a silencer. "Now," he said, "let's talk about the rest of the money." I realized then that the nightmare wasn't ending. It was just changing shape. I looked at the recording device. There was 1 minute of audio left. I pressed play, and Sarah's voice said the one thing I never expected to hear. "David, don't trust the man with the scar. He's not who he says he is." The man with the scar stepped toward me, and the lights went out. I thought I was safe. I was wrong. The darkness was absolute. I could hear the man with the scar breathing a heavy, wet sound just inches from my face. Then the recording device in my hand did something I didn't expect. It emitted a blinding, strobing white light. In the flicker, I saw the man with the scar lunging, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the tall man with the silencer. Sarah hadn't just recorded a message. She had recorded a signal. The police are in the lobby. David, the recorder suddenly barked in a new loud voice. It was Lynn. The vault is on a separate grid. Get out through the panel, now. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I scrambled through the back of the safe deposit box, my bad ankle screaming as I tumbled into a narrow concrete crawl space. Behind me, I heard the muffled thwip-thwip of the silencer and a grunt of pain. I crawled until my hands hit dirt. I pushed through a rusted grate and found myself gasping for air in the same narrow alley where Min had first met me. Min was there leaning against a motorbike. He wasn't surprised. He just handed me a helmet. Your son is currently being escorted to a police van. Min said, his voice calm as the night air. The laundry operation papers, you had Lynn swap them. The ones the police found in Mark's briefcase are much, much worse. He'll be tied up in the Vietnamese legal system for years. I sat on the back of the bike, my heart finally slowing down. I looked at the heavy, rusted key still clutched in my hand. And the money, I asked. The millions in Bitcoin. Min started the engine. Sarah didn't want you to be a King David. She wanted you to be free. The private key didn't unlock a fortune for one man. It unlocked the Tin Nixia Fund. It's already been distributed to the families in the Hem, the people who protected her, the people who will now protect you. We rode through the streets of Da Nang. The neon lights of the Dragon Bridge were fading as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. I didn't have a mansion. I didn't have a retirement account. I didn't even have my original passport. But as I watched the city wake up, the street vendors setting up their steaming pots of pho, the old men playing chess on the sidewalk, I realized I had something Mark would never understand. I wasn't a problem to be solved anymore. I wasn't a liability. I looked at my hands. They were stained with hair dye and dirt shaking slightly from the adrenaline. In Ohio, my life was a countdown. Every day was a step closer to a sterile room with a barcode on my wrist. Mark wanted to lock me in a cage of beige walls and safety so he could feast on my past. Here in the chaos of 1,000 motorbikes, I was a ghost. But for the first time in 65 years, I was a ghost that could breathe. I walked into a small coffee shop near the water. The woman behind the counter didn't ask for my ID. She didn't look at me with pity. She just handed me a Savez-moi. I took a sip. The salt was sharp, the coffee was bitter, and the air smelled like the sea. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photo of Sarah. I turned it over and saw a small note I had missed before. Freedom isn't what you leave behind, David. It's what you're willing to become. I watched the sun rise over the East Sea. I had no house to return to, no son to call, and no plan for tomorrow. I'd spent my whole life building a world that eventually tried to bury me alive. I finally understood. You don't find a new life by moving to a different country. You find it by letting the old one die. The rocking chair in Ohio was empty, and I had never felt more at home. I looked down at my hands. The black hair dye was still stained deep under my fingernails, a permanent reminder of the man I had to kill to stay alive. In Ohio, those hands were meant for holding a TV remote or a plastic tray in a cafeteria. Here, they held a cup of salty coffee and a second chance. People often ask me if I'm lonely. My son is sitting in a cell a few miles from here. My wife is a ghost in my pocket. My childhood home is probably being leveled by a bulldozer right now. But when I walk through the narrow alleys of the Hem, the neighbors don't look at me with pity. They don't see a senior citizen or a liability. They just see David. Mark wanted to protect his inheritance. He thought my life was an asset to be liquidated before it depreciated. He forgot one simple thing. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. Or the most peaceful. I'm 65 years old. Back home, that's the age where you start disappearing. You become a background character in your own family's life. But as the sun hits the water of the Han River, I realize my story isn't over. I've just finished the prologue. The city is screaming with life now. The smell of grilled pork is thick in the air. I'm not trying to outrun the clock anymore. I'm finally living in it. If you're sitting in a house that feels like a cage waiting for someone else to decide your future, look at a map. There are places in this world where you aren't a problem to be solved. You just have to be brave enough to lose everything to find yourself. If you've ever wondered what it's like to stop being a liability and start being a human being again, maybe it's time you stopped watching and started packing. I'll see you at the coffee stall.